because the conspiracy theories are packaged and then laundered through media, which calibrates it for maximum plausibility, uses experts, it becomes more credible to a lot of people. The current of anti-Semitic paranoia is always a feature of almost any kind of conspiratorial movement, right, left, it doesn't really matter. But on the left, it's been mainstreamed in higher education. It's been mainstreamed in Congress.
Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. This week, we have an important conversation about conspiracy theories and the way they've been embraced by the political left with author and columnist David Harsanyi. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, you still don't have to wait a full week for more of our content. There is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. How did America get to become a nation of believers in conspiracy theories? Some date it to the John F. Kennedy assassination, an event so shocking and momentous that it was hard for many people to accept that it was merely the action of a deranged communist. But the cottage industry of books and even films that centered around efforts to provide a more satisfying explanation for Lee Harvey Oswald's actions that grew out of that chapter of history was nothing compared to the fantasies spun about just about every element of modern American life these days. There is virtually nothing that can or will happen that won't generate talk of the conspiracy theory that is now amplified by social media in a way that not even the craze about the JFK assassination could match. But perhaps the worst element of this age of conspiracies is not the fact that the most outlandish and offensive notions are believed by so many, but that so many Americans who embrace crackpot ideas and convoluted explanations for what has happened think they are not conspiracy theories. Were conspiracy theories merely confined to the fever swamps of the political right or the left, they would be potentially dangerous and troubling, but still not a major factor of our political and cultural life. Instead, they have now gone mainstream in a way that is particularly insidious, since supposedly trusted media outlets and respected political leaders openly embrace and spread them. And sadly, they do this in the name of defending important causes like democracy, the rights of women, or saving the planet. And ironically, the bulk of the conspiracy mongering is going on the political left. That's not the message we get from the mainstream media, which focuses on the lunacy that can sometimes come from the political right, including a shadowy and insignificant group like QAnon, which has few supporters and none with any political influence. But unlike most of the conspiracies hatched on the right, those on the left have been treated as legitimate and true, despite being continually debunked and the blatant political motivations of most of the conspiracy theorists. They are what author David Harsanyi has rightly labeled BlueAnon, the Russia collusion hoax, a plot hatched by Democratic political operatives to destroy Donald Trump, and then assisted by members of the intelligence and legal establishment, is the most conspicuous of these, and in some ways perhaps the most successful, since not only did it transfix American politics for 3 years, but is still spread and believed by many on the left. In the same way, the claim that Donald Trump is an anti-Semitic supporter of neo-Nazis or a second Adolf Hitler is treated as mainstream discourse on the political left. Other recent examples are the way so many Americans were willing to believe lies about mass killings of African Americans by police, lies about American history that created a mass movement dedicated to smearing the United States as guilty of systematically racist and irredeemably so, exaggerated and always wrong predictions about the extinction of the planet and conspiracies about the subjugation of women in the United States. Another key element of conspiracy theorizing is the way anti-Semitism frequently plays a role. The spreading of lies about Israel both before and after the atrocities of October 7th, 2023, in which it is falsely accused of being an apartheid state and committing genocide, is an illustration of how conspiracy theories are normalized and work to spread hatred of Jews in the same way that they have for many centuries. And here again, the most frustrating element is the way, unlike the extremists of the right, those on the left, like the members of the Congressional Squad and MSNBC's Al Sharpton, are given a pass for spewing hate for Jews, but defended as victims of a vast right-wing conspiracy, to use Hillary Clinton's description of those who tried to hold her husband accountable for his lies. It all adds up to a political and media culture which treats delusional theories as truth and works overtime to brand skeptics as dangerous dissidents. In his new book, The Rise of BlueAnon, How the Democrats Became a Party of Conspiracy Theorists, David Harsanyi performs a valuable public service by cataloging the conspiracy theories of the left and how they have dominated our public discourse while destroying faith in our institutions and undermining democracy and also fueling anti-Semitism. And we're pleased to have him with us today. David Harsanyi is a senior writer at the Washington Examiner and contributor to the New York Post and National Review, as well as a co-host, along with Molly Hemingway, of the You're Wrong podcast on the Federalist Radio Hour. He's the author of 6 books, including Eurotrash, Why America Must Reject the Failed Ideas of a Dying Continent, First Freedom, A Ride Through America's Enduring History with the Gun, and his latest, The Rise of BlueAnon, How the Democrats Became a Party of Conspiracy Theorists. David Harsanyi, welcome back to Think Twice.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, David, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking, what are the factors that make so many of us willing to believe conspiracy theories? What is it about America in the 21st century especially that makes us such easy marks for those peddling them? And I guess the follow-up isn't the failure of our institutions, and obviously the example of lies told by many in charge of trying to do something about the COVID pandemic comes to mind, that it makes it hard not to buy into the notion that there are hidden factors determining our fate.
That's a good question. In part, it's always been part of human nature. I mean, going back to ancient Greece, there are conspiracy theories that move people, people who are powerless or people who believe they're powerless to try to explain why things are happening to them or why the world works the way it is. It is reinforced when you're in part of a mob or a crowd or a group. And in the age of the internet, it's far easier to find other people who are willing to live in a silo with you and reinforce your beliefs in conspiracy theories. And then you answered the question, basically. And on top of that now, we don't have trust in institutions anymore that we're supposed to regulate these things, debunk these things, people we could believe. In fact, many of the people, and that's partly what my book's about, is many of the people who are supposed to be, who are tasked with leading us in the right direction, debunking conspiracy theories, are the ones who spread them. And, are the ones who gaslight you into believing that what you believe is a conspiracy theory when actually what you believe is normal skepticism. So I think all of those factors make us susceptible to that. I don't know that we're more susceptible, but I do think that, than before personally, as people, but I do think that the mechanisms that drive conspiracism are more powerful in many ways.
Yeah, certainly social media. It's sort of like, imagine the JFK assassination. If social media had been around then, I guess it would be, would have been a lot worse. And I think, I would sort of trace the, conspiracy theories as a cottage industry back to that. But still, I think things have changed tremendously because of that. Now, the main thesis of The Rise of BlueAnon, your new book, is that it is the political left that is not only the source of most of the most dangerous conspiracy mongering, but that those on the left are more willing to believe in crackpot theories than those on the right, which is exactly the opposite of what we're told by the legacy media is true. Why is that?
Well, obviously, every day there's a news story about how the right is susceptible to disinformation, misinformation, usually as a rationalization for some kind of censorship, honestly. Um, the reason my argument is, and the reason I think, I don't know that people are more susceptible and left to believing it. I think, though, that because the conspiracy theories are packaged and then laundered through media, which calibrates it for maximum plausibility, uses, experts, so-called experts, who are credible people, former intelligence officers, people who ran the CIA and on and on. Um, the that it is becomes more credible to a lot of people that they can believe it. You bring in, you have social science experts, producing studies that will prove that, the right believes conspiracies and the left don't. But in fact, when you think about Russia collusion hoax, for instance, which I think was maybe the high point or the most effective conspiracy theory in American political history, in the sense that it completely paralyzed the Trump administration. It was, for 3.5 years at least, it enveloped all our conversations in political media and so on. I mean, you don't get more successful than that. Um, but it's not just that. There are, my book's also about sort of currents of paranoia that drive a lot of the issues, and we could talk about them later maybe. But so it's not always this like conspiracy theory. It's more of a paranoia that you believe things are going on behind the scenes that undermine your life. So yeah, I think it's because
Well,
it's
you
laundered.
cite
Yeah.
you cite in the book statistics showing that it's actually people on the left who are more willing to believe, theories about the world which are, are not supported, or,
Yeah.
conspiracy theories, than people on the people on the right are actually more skeptical. I mean, that's, as I said, that's the opposite of what we're supposed to think.
Yeah.
We're supposed to think that people on the right are the ones with the tinfoil hats. And yet it's really the people on the left. It's just that CNN and the New York Times keep telling them that it's, that they're right. They're not crazy.
But think about, the 2000s, okay? I mean, now George Bush is this grand statesman. Everyone loves him. But at the time, there were a lot of conspiracy theories about how first of all, he was called a Nazi, or people intimated he was a Nazi all the time. But also, think about Michael Moore. He produced a documentary that is filled with the just most unhinged conspiracy theories about the world, right?
Mhm.
He gets a standing ovation at the Oscars. That documentary is one of the top grossing documentaries of all time.
We're talking about Fahrenheit.
Fahrenheit 9/11, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, sorry. And um, a poll in 2006, I believe it was, showed that over 50% of Democrats believed that George Bush knew 9/11 was going to happen to benefit from it beforehand. 2018, there's a poll, more than one poll actually, that shows nearly 60% of Democrats believe that not that Russians put up Facebook ads and convinced, credulous people to vote for Donald Trump, but that they changed vote totals. They've gone beyond what the conspiracy is on CNN. And so the left has shown a propensity for that kind of thing for a while. We haven't, because of, the media hasn't been tracking that, or they're not that interested in polling certain questions that make the left look bad. But when you actually look at them, they're often worse. I mean, obviously, there's birtherism or whatever. There's all kinds of conspiracies, though we have to be careful, because I think it's okay to ask questions. I mean, you can be skeptical of things, but once, facts are in, you should, it's time to move on. But it's clear, yeah, like you mentioned, that the left is often more open to believing conspiracy theories about the world than the right is. Maybe because they're more skeptical of the state. I don't know what the psychological reasons are, but I think so, yeah.
Yeah. The data that you write about in the book certainly backs you up. Now, you've already alluded to this because you describe in the book the claim that Donald Trump colluded with the Russians to win the 2016 election as the greatest hoax in American history. And I'm inclined to agree with you. Yet a vast number of Americans not only bought it at the time that it dominated the news and largely sabotaged the first years of the Trump presidency, but still believe it. I get that when I referred to it as a hoax in my writing and in the comments, and despite all the evidence that it was a hoax, and that even sort of the mainstream media that promoted it moved on. Why did it succeed in ways that other political plots and conspiracies did not?
Well, people might not like to hear this, but to some extent, Trump was very different than any other candidate. And,
Yeah. Well,
saying,
that's true,
yeah,
obviously.
yeah. So saying, I hope Russia finds those emails, stuff like that, you know, kind of helped partisans be more inclined to believe things about him that weren't
Even though
true.
he was obviously joking. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think over the years, maybe over almost a decade, we've come to realize that he uses hyperbole or the way he speaks is a little different and so on, but
Selena Zito's formula has continued to be true. Trump's critics take him literally but not seriously, and his fans take him seriously but not literally. I mean, we have to always remind ourselves of that.
yeah, to me, he reminds me of people I knew growing up, around Queens and that part of the world in New York, who, and I forgot what the comedian was who says, a New Yorker doesn't say, traffic's bad. They say it's murder. They're always just, using these words, and then the media will run and get hysterical over it. But the thing with the conspiracy theories so they began the conspiracy theory. They're always, like I mentioned in the book, there are cynical people, the Hillary Clinton types who concoct the hoax, and then there are credulous partisans, and everyone has them, but Democrats have a lot of them. So I'm not sure where like a reporter at CNN is now. Either they're not skeptical, then they shouldn't be a reporter, or they're helping, they shouldn't be a reporter. Either way, whoever spread that conspiracy should be out of the job. But anyway, so here's what happens. These things always compound. The more questions you ask, people will say, conspiracy theorists will say, well, that's exactly what you would ask if or they cobble together all kinds of threads and make it into a story. So, it starts with, oh, the Russians helped, Donald Trump put up Facebook ads, whatever it was. And it ends with Donald Trump has been an asset of the KGB since 1987, which is a real story that was in New York Magazine, an 8,000 word story on that. So, I don't remember what you asked me. Oh, why did they believe it? I think partly because they wanted to believe it. Their hatred of Donald Trump, their aversion to how he is, leads people to believe, confirm their priors in a way. Everyone's susceptible to that as well. And we try to fight against that. But it's like when I was a Metro reporter in Denver, and someone would call me and give me the perfect story. I immediately knew that it can't be right. That they're either using me, but it can't be perfect. There is no perfect story. And the president of the United States being a Manchurian candidate or whatever is too perfect a story. And they should have been quite skeptical of it. Anyway, so I just think they believed it because they hated him. They believed it because hysteria sort of breeds hysteria. So do you remember every time a new story broke, the whole media would just melt down. It would be the biggest story. And after a while, you realize you had to wait like a day or two
The
to make
silver
sure.
bullet was always just around the corner. It was always
Exactly.
just there.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then they just moved on like nothing had happened. There was no reckoning. No one lost a job. They all had better jobs. Adam Schiff is now a senator,
Yeah, right.
and
They failed upward, for sure.
yeah, yeah. I mean, did they fail though? I mean, I think they failed, but for them, it was a success. They paralyzed Donald Trump's presidency.
They won, the reporters won Pulitzer Prizes. No,
Right,
the
exactly.
people at the Times and the Washington Post have not returned their Pulitzer Prizes.
Right. So now, when I was a kid, if I read a newspaper, if I read the New York Times, obviously we all knew it had a bias. Like not a kid, whenever I started reading the New York Times, young person, wasn't a 10-year-old going through there, but you knew to read between the lines. You knew that it was a biased publication, but you never thought they'd make something up from whole cloth. So now we can't really trust anything they say anymore, and that is where you get the break in trust. Donald Trump could literally do something terrible right now and they would report it and no one would believe it. And that's actually not good for, a free nation. You want a press that you can at least trust to some extent. And we don't have that now.
Yeah, I think that gets really partly to the heart of it. There's a whole generation that have sort of entered our profession who really don't believe in journalism. They believe in activism. They think that journalism is activism. And so I think we see, I think both of us are objective enough to see it on our own side of the political spectrum. And I think some of that, like when Matt Gaetz was, when Trump nominated Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, and all these stories started coming out, including many from his congressional colleagues, his Republican congressional colleagues, saying he was terrible. The knee-jerk response on the left was to say, "Aha, that's what we think about all of you." And from people on the right, including some people we know, trust, and like, the instinct was to defend him because he's just being lied about the way they lied about Brett Kavanaugh, the way they lied about Donald Trump, and they were willing to die on that hill, including, as I say, some people we know, like, and trust.
Yeah, it's a problem. Again, I'm not sure people don't like to hear this, but there is a cultish kind of loyalty to the president. It's not about being a conservative. It's about MAGA. It's about him. I think that's problematic
But it's
because,
also about the intense distrust of those who have been
yeah,
attacking him unfairly.
no,
And
it's completely understandable in a way. Yeah, I mean, but now, and I've argued with people who I like very much about this. So what now? Because Kavanaugh happened, and that radicalized me in a way, that event. But there's no Republican we can ever credibly talk about doing something wrong again. I mean, it is
sometimes people are guilty.
yeah, sometimes people are guilty. So that's a problem. And yeah, it has to again do with if it weren't for a few senators privately, I guess, standing up to Trump on that issue, he would have gone through. And yeah, I mean, that's a problem, and that does speak to the trust issue. Not just trust in the media, but we have a distrust of almost every institution, well earned, from the Secret Service to the public health officials we have, to the government, to the FBI, to all these institutions that we once sort of most people sort of trusted. I bet you. Maybe they exist, but if they had polled trust factors in, the FBI, and they're probably very high in the past.
Well, the FBI, had sort of a major propaganda, outlet in popular culture for, half a century on radio and television, when people really watched listened to radio and watched television. That was the one thing the FBI was really good at. I don't think anybody would, sort of buy it about the FBI today.
No. It is interesting. I've been thinking about the FBI lately and how it basically just started as this. It's been corrupt since its founding. Basically, it was run by a dictatorial figure who did whatever he wanted, spied on politics. Yeah,
but people loved it. People,
yeah.
I remember when I was a kid, and there was this show on television, which was the successor of a long-running radio show, long before both of us were born, about the FBI. And I had a friend's father who was himself, an immigrant from Germany, a Jew who had fled Germany. And it was his favorite show. And I couldn't believe it because it was so corny. And I once asked him, why do you watch this? And he said, because the good guys always win. And that meant a lot to him, given where he had come from. But like, who would believe that now? And that's, sort of, we've come a long way from Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., and the FBI in Peace and War.
Yeah. Yeah.
You in your book, in BlueAnon, in The Rise of BlueAnon, you sort of trace it back to the early years of this, of this century, and stuff about George W. Bush and, Democrats denying elections. Well, I want to focus on just the last few years. As interesting as that topic is, and as much as that has gone straight down the Orwellian memory hole. But as soon as the Russian hoax collapsed in 2019 with the Mueller report disappointing Democrats, that was soon replaced by another conspiracy theory that revolved around the idea that Donald Trump and his supporters were seeking to destroy democracy, which also played a key role in the 2024 election, which we've just experienced, which he won. Is this obsession with Trump and the need to believe that he is uniquely evil, just partisan politics gone mad? Or does it, in an era where, I would say politics now plays the role that religion used to play in most people's lives, represent something new in our culture that makes conspiracy theory so central to the thinking of so many people?
That's interesting. I mean, I do think the lack of faith, or not even just faith, but religious institutions, meaning a lot in people's lives, have turned people to the state far too much. So yeah, they put way They care way too much. I mean, seeing people cry after an election is so off-putting to me. It just tells me that you're way, way, way too invested in politics. Not to say it doesn't affect our lives, but, I mean, really, does your life change that much from day to day? But I saw, when it looked like DeSantis was, listen, I should start by saying Trump is a black hole. I don't mean that in a negative sense, but he pulls everything towards it. Everyone
in the sense of science. Yeah.
Exactly. So it is
Believe the
almost impossible
science.
not to write about him and not to make everything about him. I detest that because you know, if I write something, critical of Trump, everyone jumps on me and says, I'm a Trump hater. I'm a never Trumper. If I praise him, everyone's like, if Charles Manson ran, you would defend him, if you pick Charles Manson. So there's no way to really win that. And I don't think I should try, or anyone should try. We should just write what we believe. But when DeSantis, it looked like DeSantis might actually run and Trump might not run.
Hard
because
to
of all the-
remember as that is, but a couple of years
Yeah,
ago, that was sort of
Yeah.
probably where I thought he had at least a
and the
puncher's chance.
everyone thought maybe the lawfare was going to cripple Trump. In fact, it just helped him, I think, very much.
It killed DeSantis, actually.
Yeah, exactly. So, you could see the same sort of thing creeping in, the same sort of paranoia, that he was part of a death cult in Florida during COVID, that he was worse than Trump because he was going to, he was much more competent and he was going to dismantle all these institutions and stuff. So I think almost every Republican would have had to have dealt with the same kind of rhetoric. I think that at some point, maybe during the Obama years, Democrats started, no matter what I wrote about Obama, I'd get an email saying, you're a racist, so everything became very race-centric, which I think is also part of our paranoia problem with race. But, and then it became, you're phobic of this, you're phobic of that. And it got to the point where Democrats stopped debating and they would just essentially accuse you of sedition, accuse you of being a Russia dupe, accuse you of being bought by the NRA, who wanted to see dead children, this kind of stuff. And it just constantly gets ratcheted up to the point where the president of the United States stood there in front of the crimson, red background in Philadelphia and said that, half of America were abetting semi-fascism, whatever that is. So, and then it seemed like they couldn't really debate anymore. I can't remember the last time I've had a policy debate with someone on the left. It's always, your intention, about your intentions or about democracy or all this stuff. Take abortion. When was the last time anyone actually had a debate with someone on the left about when does life begin or something like that? It almost never happens.
Other than that guy that goes to college campuses, skewering college kids. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's the only one who does.
But you know what I mean? It's just, there's no more, when I started out or, even in the blogging years, there were so many policy debates that crossed, you would debate not just people on your own side, but the other side. I rarely see that ever happening. And what's interesting to me is I always mention Scott Jennings, I think is his name, on CNN, who does a really good job there, really good job. What's interesting to me is not that he is so much better at debating issues. It's that sometimes he brings up stuff and the other people, they're just clueless that anyone even thinks that way or some issue that they never even thought about. As a writer, I mean, I don't know how good a job I do, but I try to understand the other side's position and where they're coming from. I try to frame that fairly, and then I try to knock it down as best I can, but I don't think the other side actually understands where the right's coming from. It's much easier just to say you're fascist and this and that, and democracy is just a euphemism for whatever Democrats are thinking at the time. There's really no shared shared set of facts that we debate over anymore. It's just So
people read, watch, listen to different media, and they isolate themselves on social media, which has made that less worse. So we are just a bifurcated country.
Yeah. I mean, and social media, it's terrible in many ways, but also allows us. I mean, you remember when we grew up, we had 3 stations and there were gatekeepers and they told you whatever they felt like.
4 middle-aged white guys said it was at 6:30 p.m. every night.
And, everyone talks glowingly about people like Walter Cronkite now, but I actually think he was, quite often he would just lead the American people wherever he felt like, I mean, everyone is biased. This idea that you can have unbiased reporters is ridiculous. What we need are people who present facts fairly, and we need a diverse, you're biased because of your ideology, but also regionalism, your faith. There's a million reasons that, that sort of you see the world through a certain prism, and there are reasons for that. And that's fine. This is why I think you need conservatives in newsrooms so they can report on other stuff. And so anyway, I think so. In that sense, I think social media is good that we can debunk stories and we can, debate things. Unfortunately, so you live with the bad and hopefully some of the good. But yeah, I'm not sure that it was much better in the past. We were lied to quite often, and by three people. Yeah. So.
Well, I guess I'll go back a little bit. The left answers doubts about its Trump is Hitler conspiracy mongering by pointing to January 6th and election denial. But in The Rise of BlueAnon, you point out that denying elections was normalized by Democrats long before Trump claimed the 2020 election was stolen.
Yeah. Listen, I think Trump had every right, for instance, in 2020 to go through legal channels to challenge an election. Part of being free and in a democracy and so on is that you get to have transparency and challenge results. I don't like the stuff he did and said. I think it's a little paranoid. I don't think he can lose, but Al Gore couldn't really lose either, and John Kerry in 2004, people forget now, every major Democrat I laid out in the book cast doubt on Ohio's results. Every single one
in 2004, yeah.
Yeah, in 2004.
Which was the last time a Republican won the popular vote before this
right.
year.
And 2016, obviously, they did what they did. And even I note in my book, the New York Times, for instance, will give a hearing to any crazy conspiracy you have about an election if you're from the left. So they recently or last year ran a story from a guy who's in his 80s who claimed that Ronald Reagan stole the 80 election by making a deal with the Iranians not to release the hostages. Now, this is not new. It's been around. But, you can write about it. I don't care. But the guy offered no evidence. There's no proof. There was not a slip of paper. There was not a airline. He said he had gone and made this deal. There was not an airline ticket. There was no hoop. But the New York Times will give it a hearing. They'll give a hearing to any kind of crazy conspiracy like that. And if the right did it, they would go bananas. But they do it all the time. So they are election deniers. And they didn't this time. It was a pretty emphatic win, I guess. And it was very difficult for them. I don't think, they knew what to do. I also think they came with Hillary. I think it was a shock to most people that he won. But with Kamala, I think most people felt like it was not going in the right direction for them pretty early. And
it was a tough year for them with having to defend Biden and basically lie about Biden, Biden's ability to function. And when that reached a dead end, then they were stuck with Kamala, and now they're still debating that. But yeah, it was harder for them to deny this time. But
and you made a great point about activism. Think about what they did by covering up Joe Biden's acuity decline and physical decline, and then when they couldn't gaslight us anymore, they just turned on a dime and did something else and got her, into the they just backed her basically. That is not journalism. The journalists I worked with who were older when I was young, they were like commies basically, but they relished taking down the powerful. They didn't really care if they had a story.
They were in the grand American tradition of being against the government. That's what reporters always were.
Yeah.
But now so many in the press, because they have, replaced journalism with activism. They're part of a state media at times, except when a Republican is in power.
Yeah, I mean, think about that, and people ask me, is it changing because Jeff Bezos didn't endorse, and it's a culture problem from the bottom up. It's not, you can't just fix this with a few owners, Think about the New York Times op-ed editor was fired because there was a rebellion with, assistant editors and editorial page writers who rebelled against him because he had allowed someone who had a different opinion have a voice. The rebellion at the Washington Post was all about, the paper not being an activist entity. No one, the idea that your endorsement matters for president anyway at this point in history is ridiculous. I think pretty much. Maybe lower races, judges, whatever. Maybe people take a peek to see what they're supposed to do. But the presidency, I think most people who read the Washington Post have their minds made up on that one.
Speaking of, listen, the only people who care about unsigned editorials are the people who write unsigned editorials. Speaking of somebody who used to do that, I mean,
Me too.
it's an art form,
Yeah.
that I enjoyed. But the idea that it actually determined elections was always a myth, even when more newspapers published them. Another key episode of modern conspiracy theorizing is the way the Black Lives Matter movement successfully peddled a big lie about police and the shootings of unarmed and innocent African Americans. What made that work so well, and how was it bound up with the effort to convince Americans not only that their country is irredeemably and systematically racist, and justifying the takeover of American education by woke ideologues determined to foment racial division rather than heal it? How did that succeed so magnificently, just as the Russian collusion one did?
I mean, the easiest answer to that is that people feel guilty, and they want to do the right thing. But it is, I think, the most pernicious current of paranoia on the left is racial. The idea that there is a systemic effort, for instance, to stop people from voting. It's just simply untrue. It is easier to vote now than ever. In the strictest state that exists, it is easier to vote now than it's ever been, and probably anywhere in the world. They will mail you a ballot. All you have to do is fill it out and send it back. Minimal effort. So and I think the Georgia results show that, that was a myth. Calling it Jim Crow 2.0, that's disgusting, right? And it's also paranoid. Or the idea, as we're talking about BLM, is that, white cops are out there hunting black males and that no one cares, or that actually they want this to happen. The numbers don't show that that's true. And when you think about BLM, many of the bedrock, cases that made that movement explode had no racial component that we know of. Some of them were complete myths, like Michael Brown, but
In
many of them had
Ferguson, Missouri, which was really the place where it began.
Yeah. And on CNN, hands up, don't shoot. They were, putting their hands up and stuff, which is a complete mythology that never happened. So, corporations participate, many Republicans participate, because it's, it feels good to be on the side of the oppressed and all of that. And victimhood, as I mentioned earlier, is a component to why people believe conspiracies. So what the left does, they run basically every institution in the country, but yet somehow they can convince large groups of people that they are still victims. Mm-hmm. So, they've won so many cultural battles that they have to continue to come up with new ones, transgenderism, whatever, because they're running out of victims, because there really aren't many victims in this country as far as groups go.
Yeah, well, that is certainly true. And it's partly, the long march of sort of the ideological left to take over American education, I think, is in some ways the most significant. And it's not just education, because, we spoke of the change in journalism. It's because the younger generation of journalists were indoctrinated in a lot of these, in these divisive, toxic, myths about race. And that's influenced everything they do, in how they cover everything.
I was reading a piece on music, nothing to do with politics at all. And in the middle of it, the writer says, mentions the Israeli genocide that's getting worse and worse. And we haven't spoken about that, but there's the current of anti-Semitic paranoia is always a feature of almost any kind of conspiratorial movement, right, left. It doesn't really matter. But on the left, it's been mainstreamed in higher education. It's been mainstreamed in Congress to some extent. On the right, they exist, and a lot of people listen to some of these podcasts where people are anti-Semitic, but they're still not policymakers. They're still somewhat on the fringe. I've never, I don't think, as we know, Donald Trump isn't scared to be pro-Israel because he might make someone mad about it. So there's a difference, I think.
Yeah, well, in your book, that you anticipated my next question, which was in your book, you devote a considerable amount of space to the way anti-Semitism and obsessive demonizing of Jews in Israel are as essential to contemporary conspiracy theories as they were to those in the past. And I guess the question is, why has the political left embraced anti-Semitism at a time when the political right has, with some exceptions, and people like Candace Owens, and I would argue Tucker Carlson, largely rejected it?
Well, we all know that anti-Semitism has been a big part of the left from the beginning. Karl Marx was an anti-Semite, despite his, coming from rabbinic tradition and all that. But I think within progressivism, there's this idea that a few shady people behind in the shadows are controlling the whole entire economy. It's a zero sum view of the world. AOC has this view that the only reason you're poor is because someone else is getting rich off you, which is not how it works.
Yeah,
Unfortunately,
like her dress at the Met Gala a few years ago.
Exactly, just ridiculous. Yeah, but unfortunately, a lot of this zero sum thing, I think, is cropped up in economic populism on the right as well. Though I'm not saying those people, I'm not saying like J.D. Vance is anti-Semitic at all. I don't think he is. But he also, the robber barons of Wall Street are taking. So this creates, this is driven by envy and paranoia about other people. Now, of course, I'm not saying every corporation, just like I'm not saying there aren't any racists in the world. I'm not saying that, every corporation acts in the right way or doesn't ever rip anyone off or doesn't ever do anything wrong. Of course they do. But the idea that people are operating in the shadows in groups to, even lobbyists. I'm saying lobbyists don't exist. I'm not saying they don't have some say, but the idea that you have, seed oil in your in your fries because of some conspiracy like RFK seems to think, and because people want to make you sick. That's paranoid thinking. I know my book's not about the right, but I think it's creeping in there as well to some extent. Yeah.
Yeah, well, to drill down a bit more on anti-Semitism and, the myths about Israel committing genocide, which is, as you say, it pops up everywhere. And certainly the arts, we could do a whole program about how the arts have been, sort of gone woke, and, every major arts company, and certainly in the fine arts, has its own woke commissar. But in some ways, this was supposed to be fixed by Holocaust education, that and why do you think the enormous effort to spread knowledge about the Holocaust failed to effectively combat not only Holocaust denial, but also to counter conspiratorial thinking about Israel and the Jews today?
I'm sure you've probably seen this, but there is considerable evidence that the more you teach people about the Holocaust now, the more likely they are to say it didn't happen. Maybe they can't wrap their minds around it. Maybe they don't care. Maybe they don't like being feeling guilty, or they don't like seeing it, and they lash out in that way. I think it's important to remember that we do have because of social media, we have a bunch of people, probably mostly young males, who like to upset other people, so they like to go on there and say things, anti-Semitic things, racist things, whatever, because it upsets people. They get a thrill out of it. So sometimes I wonder how many people, are really anti-Semitic, and how many people are just out there joyriding, or whatever. I don't know the answer to that. I think a lot of what the problem is our universities, these people are historically illiterate, especially on that topic. They don't know anything about it. I've never seen so many people chime in about an issue they know so little about as Israel. They don't, I don't know. I also think a lot of this stuff becomes trendy. So I see a lot of young people have the little Palestinian flag in their, on their Twitter account. Do they really understand or know anything about what's going on? I don't think so. They see a brown person being, in their mind, being oppressed by a white colonialist, and they jump, into that issue. So when you do polling, most people are still pro-Israel. I think any mature person is going to be anti-terrorist and pro-Western civilization. And I'm sorry that the Democratic Party's gone in a different direction. And I think the Jewish vote shifting pretty dramatically. And I have to say, I was completely surprised by that because I've heard it a million times and it never actually happened. But I think the Democrats have gone too far. And one of the problems, you didn't ask me about this, but is the Jewish leadership in all American Jewish leadership, virtually, by the way, but especially in Congress. You had Chuck Schumer and people like this. They're willing to look the other way because their religion is politics, and they don't care that there are anti-Semites in their midst. They don't do anything about it, and they don't say anything about it. So they deserve to lose as many Jewish votes as we possibly can pull away from them.
Yeah, well, the failure of Jewish leadership is a constant theme on this podcast and often on JNS, certainly in my columns and elsewhere. So forgive me for not, throwing it at you reflexively. But I think, you mentioned, how the Marxist, problem, the Marxist origin of much of the anti-Israel propaganda, and the way it has been normalized on the left. And to my mind, that is because of, the critical race theory and intersectionality, which divides the world into two perpetually warring groups of victims and white oppressors, and assumes that Israelis and Jews are white
Right.
oppressors, even though that has nothing to do with actually the population of Israel, which by the definition of the left, the majority of Israeli Jews are actually people of color because they trace their origins to the Middle East or North Africa. But it is something that has been normalized on the left. It's not, and it's quite frankly, it's not just even the squad anymore. The few, congressional leftists. The squad has grown in numbers since its debut in 2018, but the intersectional sort of activist core of the Democratic Party has shown, and indeed, some of the attacks on Kamala Harris was that she wasn't anti-Israel enough. And Biden, too, who they call Genocide Joe, despite the fact that, he's been very ambiguous about his support for Israel. Its roots in the political left are deep, and they're far more mainstream than I'm willing to acknowledge them, that, the stray right winger and, Candace Owens, Tucker, that it's just made it more, not only become normalized, but it has made it more mainstream to believe in anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, such as the ones that are believed about what is happening right now in Gaza and in the battle with Hezbollah and Hamas.
Yeah, and you make a great point about how they take this identitarian racial view of the world and impose it on a place where it's not even happening. And I'll give you the perfect example of that is Ta-Nehisi Coates's book, his garbage book about Israel, where, he essentially just does he literally does that. He speaks about, he even makes comparisons between slave owners and settlers, which, are just Jews living in their historic homeland and so on. So it's just obviously a trendy thing to do. And he wrote not his whole book, but a big part of his book is about Israel, and he knows nothing about it, but he can get away with this. Probably was a runaway bestseller. I don't know how many he sold, and people treat him with reverence when he
They
is.
got a rollout as if it would be a bestseller.
Yeah, I
Let's
don't
just
know
say
if it
that.
was in the end. Yeah, but my kid went to school. She had to read a Ta-Nehisi Coates books, right? Like, so, and he's a racist. His heroes that he mentioned in the book were all anti-Semites, from Angela Davis on, and he is an anti-Semite, and he's celebrated, and it's fine, because I think because of the color of his skin.
Yeah, well, it's a terrible book, but it's actually very an ignorant book, a book, about, in part, a large part about the Middle East, published a year after October 7th, that never mentions October 7th, that never mentions terrorism, never mentions the word Hamas. So in that sense, it's actually very insightful because it tells us exactly how the political left and the fashionable political left thinks.
Completely rationalizes the violence. He doesn't mention October 7th and doesn't mention Hamas, and the only time he mentions terrorism is to describe early Zionists, by doing all that, he's saying, he's rationalizing and justifying what Hamas has done. He doesn't understand anything about the situation. He didn't even bother speaking to an Israeli about anything. He
His
probably
entire
hasn't.
experience of the region is 10 days in quote unquote Palestine.
Yeah, on a literary, cultural retreat with Palestinian writers mostly. So on the other side, I think there's a different dynamic going on, which has been around a while, with Buchanan and others, is that the paleocon types think that Israel and Jews, in extension, have too much influence over American foreign policy. So it is easy for them to constantly blame that influence on any war we're in, especially anything to do with the Middle East, when it is far more complicated than that. I am positive that Bibi would have rather have gone after Iran than Iraq, for instance, or and stuff like that. So, but they
Certainly
blame.
that's what Ariel Sharon told George W. Bush, who didn't want to hear it.
Yeah.
At the time.
Yeah. So, but they will blame the Amen lobby and all of, whatever they called it during the Bush years. So, there's that threat. And then that grows into something, more nefarious, especially with someone like Candace Owens, who, let's face it, is an ignoramus as well. I mean, she knows nothing. She thought that Muslims couldn't leave the Muslim quarter in Jerusalem. She doesn't know anything. So, it's sad that people listen to them, but this, I guess we can take it back to the beginning, has something to do with the lack of trust. People can't turn to her because they don't know where else, it's a place to go, and they don't trust the normal people, the people who normally would give them facts about the Middle East to present them fairly or not to just make them up. So.
Yeah, and I think it's also a lack of leadership on the political left from, the same people. You rightly mentioned Pat Buchanan and sort of the anti-Semitic stuff that he tried to mainstream in the early 90s around the time of the first Gulf War. But to counter him was William Buckley, who in the 1960s kicked the lunatics of the John Birch Society out of the political right. He was a gatekeeper, but a gatekeeper for good. And he did the same thing when he wrote his book, in the early 90s about anti-Semitism, calling out Buchanan and Joe Sobran, who were, sort of colleagues of his, people he knew. And, but there's been no similar attack on the political left from a sort of someone, assuming that there was someone of comparable stature on the left, to rout the anti-Semitic lunatics from liberalism. In fact, liberalism has proved itself to be defenseless against them.
Many so-called Jewish groups are part of it. They've distorted what Judaism means. They've molded these quacky factions, I guess you call them, that claim Judaism but have nothing to do with Judaism really. As far as anything having to do with the faith or with the ethnicity or the history of Judaism, they've just concocted these organizations that participate or justify the anti-Semitism, which is horrifying in a way, and that's why I was kind of felt happy when I saw the numbers were after the election that all of American Jewry hasn't, been lost in a way, not because they voted Republican, but because they said, no, we've had enough of this from the Democrats and the left. I don't know how they get over it because it's so integral. These factions are such a big, Democrats have to cobble together all these factions to win an election. They can't lose any of them really. And the progressive parts of their party need to be patted on the head and give, I don't know how they're going to move forward. But anyway, you're right with Buchanan and folks like I've met Pat Buchanan. He's probably not an anti-Semite. Like, he cares that you're Jewish. He's probably very nice to anyone he met, but it's more like a political anti-Semitism, I guess I'd call it. Whereas on the left, you have, there's a reason that all these attacks on Jewish people happen in Brooklyn and in blue, areas and in colleges. Like, this is much more, in a way, I'm not saying it's okay what paleocons do, but I think that this is more dangerous in a way, more violent, potentially more violent. And when you see the far left get together with Islamists, basically, that becomes really a dangerous thing. And it's not new either, as even in Entebbe, you had communist Germans participating. The communists have always sort of seen this third world struggle against colonialism and all that as part of what they're fighting against. So it makes natural sense that those two get together. The problem is, they're getting together at Harvard and Columbia and places that were supposed to produce our best, and they're producing a bunch of just violent dimwits, basically, and not everyone, but a lot of them.
Yeah. Well, I would be remiss without, touching on one of the, sort of important themes in your book, because perhaps one of the most far-reaching conspiracy theories of the 21st century is the widespread belief that the planet is melting and that global warming will make us extinct at some point soon, though, as you point out, the dates do vary. Why are so many of us ready to play Chicken Little and believe the world is coming to an end, even to the point of stifling any debate about the issue and labeling anyone who questions it or asks questions as anti-science and the equivalent of those who think the earth is flat? And I would say, again, to sort of, drill down deeper, have ideas about the evils of capitalism turned a scientific debate into one that is really a religious one, about a sinful mankind being punished, much like the Noah story in the first book of the Bible?
I mean, I think that's it right there. You saw, I think Rush Limbaugh even talked about this many years ago, that it has all the hallmarks of a religion, the apocalypse, everything, sinning.
But instead of a God, instead of, sort of the God of the Tanakh, of the Bible, of Judaism and Christianity, it's Mother Nature punishing, a sinful mankind.
Yeah, it's almost like a regression, into animist or like idolatry or something. But anyway, I do think that many people believe it because it takes the place of faith. I mean, the way they talk about it, but like everything else, all the other things we talked about, it's the same mechanisms are in place. It's easier to say that you're a, knuckle-dragging troglodyte and not have to debate, what are we really doing here? Are we really going to shut down capitalism? It's easier to do that, and they've been doing that for many years. The problem is that, boy cried wolf stuff. I mean, they've been warning and warning, and things don't get worse because it is a lot, at least this is my opinion, easier to acclimate to a little different weather and deal with it through technology than shut down all of modernity and start again in some different way.
But as the Green New Deal would actually have us do.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, but then, like with everything else, there are the credulous people and there are the cynical people. And the cynical people who do this, and maybe some of them are true believers, actually, they are willing to try to scare people into action because they're socialists, essentially, and they want to, I mean, if you control carbon dioxide, you control the entire economy, and that's what they want to do. So this isn't just another way for them to have the state tell you how to live your life. And do-gooders, like, throughout history, want the state to tell you how to live your life. It's just, I think, everyone, again, like all the other stuff we talked about, higher education, scientists participate, everyone participates in trying to scare you into acting a certain way, into believing something that isn't true. I wouldn't call it a conspiracy theory, but I do think it's a hoax, and I don't mean it in kind of the rough way that a lot of people say it. I'm not saying that the weather doesn't, the climate hasn't changed at all, but I am saying that people realized initially that no one was acting on it, and the only way to get them to act was to say that their cities were going to be underwater. And, when the cities don't go underwater, people ignore it.
Right.
So,
and, Al Gore's film, which, as you note in your book, which was widely, acclaimed,
Academy
and
Awards,
won an Oscar like Michael Moore, made a lot of claims that have already been proven untrue, but nobody cares.
Yeah, and there's no big story about how Al Gore was wrong about everything, There's no big story now about how we never should have trusted the whole climate, alarmist, media.
12 years until Armageddon or whatever date they're currently.
Yeah. And then you have, the Greta Thunbergs and others who are like, she's the Joan of Arc, like she, it's almost a religious, they had her on the cover of Time magazine, and she knows nothing and about the world or science or anything. And this is a perfect example. She's on the, pro-Hamas,
Well, that was my next question, because And because she is anti-democratic, she's an authoritarian, but she illustrates what you talk about in your book, the way so many of these conspiracy theories blend together in the way that leftist activists migrate between the causes. And, when it comes to Greta Thunberg, who seems to have given up ranting about taking us back to the pre-industrial age lately in favor of promoting other conspiracy theories about the Jews committing genocide and Israel being an apartheid state.
Well, what was it? I think it was BLM. One of the BLM groups, put out a picture of I think it was October 8th, put
Mhm.
out, some kind of statement, and
With hang
actually,
gliders, yeah,
yeah, the hang
glorifying
gliders, yeah,
the murderers and rapists and kidnappers of Hamas.
right. And it just shows you what incredible hypocrites they are, that they can justify sexual torture and rape and killing of children, in a cause that they believe in. And let's be honest, the left has been far more. It's another thing, I'm not even sure it's in the book. I hadn't thought of it, but constantly they always are depicting the right wing as a potential terrorist, and it happens. But the left has been far more violent in American history, going back to the anarchists of the early century, but also through in the 70s, there were terrorist attack, all kinds of terrorism going on from left-wing groups, not right-wing groups. And think about what BLM, the BLM rights. Think about the pro-Hamas riots, and things that they did. And think about the 60s. The left has always been more violent than the right in American politics.
Yeah, well, they focus on Charlottesville, which was horrible, a neo-Nazi rally, but we've had thousands of Charlottesvilles since October 7th, and nobody on the political left or at the New York Times, seems to care about that.
No, I mean, kids dressed cosplaying as Hamas terrorists or running around with Hezbollah flags. I don't even know, people mock them, queers for Gaza or whatever. But, you can mock them because it is dumb in a way. But it's also a natural alliance, like I mentioned. I mean, they have the same enemies: Western society, Judeo-Christian beliefs, traditional ideas about how we have family and all that. So. And our system. So I think it's
but it is
pretty dangerous.
intersectionality illustrated.
That's right, exactly, intersectionality. Yeah. So
now you close your book with a section imploring conservatives to rise above the lunacy that now prevails largely on the left. But while the mainstream media depicts the effort by Trump and the GOP to combat the administrative state and the way it acts, I would argue, as an unelected fourth branch of government that obstructs Republican presidents as a conspiracy theory, isn't the deep state something that, as the Russia collusion hoax showed, very real? Where do you draw the line between justified distrust of dishonest and even corrupt government agencies and exaggerations that are as destructive to the American Republic as what we've seen coming from the left?
will you let me get away with saying, when you see it, like pornography? Because
okay, well, if that's your answer, I guess so.
Well, I mean, I very often, as I mentioned at the end of the book, they are the ones who gaslight you. They tell you what you believe is a conspiracy theory. It goes back to 1998 when Hillary Clinton sat down on the Today Show and said there was a vast right conspiracy against her husband when the Monica Lewinsky thing broke. So that happens quite often, and I think it's good to be skeptical. I think it's good to call out Democrats who claim that, everything you want to do that takes us back to a more legitimate American republic is some sort of act against democracy. I note this in my book as well. One of the things they do in their gaslighting efforts is to pretend that normal things are not, are weird or authoritarian. A tax cut, rolling back, what was it called? Internet, I forgot what it was called. Anyway, so internet, not equality, neutrality. So like whatever you do, they act like it's the end of the world and they pretend there's something weird about it. Having originalists on the court, what do? They create these conspiracies around them to pretend that Clarence Thomas is being controlled by some billionaire. Now, he's never deviated from his judicial philosophy for himself or for anyone else. Anyway, so it's hard to know when. I think skepticism is good. I think, all of that's good. But, at some point, sometimes you have to say we're moving on. Did Trump, did he lose the election, or birtherism, or whatever the right believes. I think it's important to ask questions and then move on when you've gotten an answer. It's very easy to simply dismiss stuff that is inconvenient or doesn't comport with your worldview just because it's there. And we tend to do that more and more. And like we were talking about sexual assault charges, for instance, it's very easy, or whatever. It's very easy to just dismiss them now and pretend like no Republican could ever do anything wrong simply because Brett Kavanaugh happened or the Russia collusion hoax happened. So I guess I'm just imploring people. I think in the end, people, who vote, for instance, I think, for instance, this election was the normie election. I don't think...
Right. The revenge of the normies. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think Trump is very ideological. I wouldn't even call him really a Republican in any kind of traditional sense. It's kind of normal. You tell someone, listen, I'm going to respect human beings and treat them with respect, but a boy can't be a girl. It just doesn't happen. I think, you just have to be reality-based and grounded in the long run to win these political battles. You see now the left... No one listened to them about this Hitler stuff. Every minority group went towards Trump from last time. She couldn't turn one county around in the whole country, or whatever. So I think if you're grounded in reality, you can do better in the long run, because at some point, boy cried wolf happens, and that's it. So no one listened to the media this time. No one believed them. No one trusts them. And a lot of that has to do with their conspiracy theories and their paranoia and their hyperbole and their hysteria. So I don't know. I'm just imploring the right not to go down that path. I don't know. I don't think anyone's listening to me, but we'll see.
Well, I'm listening to you, and I think the people who are listening and watching to this podcast, I think that's a great way of rounding it up. Don't believe the conspiracy theorists. And use your common sense.
Yeah.
David, thanks so much for joining us today. We often have authors on the show discussing books that they've written, but I can think of a few that are as timely and necessary as The Rise of BlueAnon, which I hope our viewers and listeners will read. You can also follow David on X at David Harsanyi and read his work in the Washington Examiner and other publications. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, or any of the other podcast platforms, watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think of it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.